Alrighty, I want to give sort of some updated thoughts on the whole Crowder versus Daily Wire scandal, and I think this will be my final word on it. I made one video about it last week, and I don't think that it's worth addressing more than twice, because I do think at the end of the day, this is mostly an inside baseball story that is not really of much interest to anyone. But I want to correct a few things because I wanted to, listen to Crowder's side of the story again when he was on Tim Pool's show, which he was last night. And I listened to him, and I have to say, I came away with thinking better of his position than I went into it. So going into it, as those of you who listened to me last week, I didn't think that he had a lot to stand on. I thought that there wasn't really anything that crazy about this Daily Wire contract. I thought that Jeremy Boring gave a pretty boring but reasoned, explanation, and he came across to me as a reasonable business person. Sure, you could say, oh, well, this contract or this proposed contract, I know that the Daily Wire people don't like to call it a contract. It was exploitative or something like that. Sure, but you don't just sign a contract that somebody hands off to you. I'm sorry. You look it over. You assume that the other side is trying to get as much value for themselves out of the deal as possible, and you have to look at that contract critically and try and find a way to get as much value out of the deal as possible for yourself. The two of you come to the table, you do some horse trading, you work things back and forth, and you come up with a happy medium that both sides can be happy with. And this goes on in every single industry. It's not just the media. And so that's why I had a problem last week with, Crowder. Not that I'm saying he shouldn't have to say whatever he wants, but it kind of, it just kind of seemed like whining to me, like, oh, you were sent an unfavorable first offer contract, by a potential employer. Boo-hoo. Tens of thousands of people get unflattering to them, job offers all the time, and they don't go on YouTube in front of their 6 million subscribers and whine about it. But I decided to listen to him last night, and I have to say, I am sympathetic. I do think that he is coming from the right place. I do think that he has a point. There are a couple things about the money that I don't think I realized when I recorded my first impressions last week, that the $50 million, which, I think everyone can agree, $50 million, that's a lot of money just in general. I didn't realize that broke down to that wasn't Crowder's personal salary. That was a budget to produce his show. So this was a purchase order, essentially, for a program. Daily Wire was contracting with Crowder to create a program and deliver 190 episodes a year for a fee of $12.5 million per year. And I think I might have realized that part, but I don't think I appreciated sort of how substantial the burden on the production costs for Crowder's side, what they were, because it's not like he's just broadcasting from his basement like Jimmy Dore, and he has his wife, working the camera. Crowder has a full studio, and he claims to have over 30 employees. So that's a pretty substantial staff, and I'm sure it's a pretty substantial facility if he's got 30 people working there, 30 plus. And so I'm not going to say that $12.5 million is it's just some crazy number. When you put it in that context, $12.5 million might seem reasonable, or it might be way too cheap, and it might not be enough to cover the costs of the show. But with that said, if that's the case, if that's all that was offered, well, then maybe to the Daily Wire folks, that's all Crowder's show is worth. And perhaps if, Crowder's show costs too much to produce relative to how much people are willing to pay to order episodes from them, maybe the show is just too expensive and can't pull its own weight. Now, I know that Mr. Crowder would argue the opposite, which is why he's out on his own. And, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, to say, you know what, no, I believe that my program generates enough value, and if you don't want to pay for that, well, then I will go and, essentially sell it myself. And he will do that by cultivating his own subscriber base, by, getting his own sponsorships and whatnot. But something, even after listening to him on Tim Pool, something that he keeps saying is it wasn't about the money. I just don't understand how that can be the case. I can understand how he would say that, if they're offering, $50 million, that's a top line number, and then they take off $100,000 when I miss a day, or they deduct 20%, off of that top line number if I get suspended on YouTube, and another 10% for Facebook and Twitter and all these other sites. Well, then our production budget, is slashed. I have to lay off all these workers, and we can't produce the show anyway. I can understand why he would have a problem with that, and why he would say, hey, this is a bad deal for me. Because I don't know all the specifics of his business. I don't think I ever said, I tried to go as, be a little extreme in my titles, as always, and I said, the Daily Wire deal was totally fair. By that, I didn't mean that I thought necessarily that if I were in Crowder's shoes, I would have taken the offer. All I was saying is that the way that the contract is written, since Crowder was saying, well, it's not about the money, it's about, the actual content of the contract, those terms seemed reasonable if you were paid a sufficient fee. Because if you're being paid enough money, well then, sure, you might lose 10% or something as a result, or some percentage. Because again, it's not about the money, Crowder said. It's not about the percentages. It's about the principle of, penalizing someone financially because they get suspended by a social media tech giant. Let's say instead of it being 20%, they only penalized you 5%. And instead of paying him $50 million over 4 years, it was $150 million. Would the contract still be unreasonable? I don't think so, because I think it is reasonable to say that whoever's contracting for these episodes, if these episodes get banned off YouTube, that is going to pose a financial burden on the media company, and that they want to hedge that a little bit. But Gerald, Crowder's new CEO, the sommelier or sommelier, whatever Crowder calls him, the wine guy, he said, well, hey, they're treating this like a partnership, but it only works one way. There's unlimited downside risk on the Crowder show side, but there's unlimited upside risk for the Daily Wire folks. So the Daily Wire is protecting themselves on the downside, but they have unlimited upside to their investment, because if Crowder makes over $50 billion, or makes them over $12.5 a year, which is what they're putting into the show, they're not going to pay Steven anything extra. But if he makes them under $12.5 a year, well, actually, it's not even based on it. It's not even based on how much money he brings into the network. It's based on him purely if he gets suspended from social media or not. So, in theory, Crowder could be bringing in $15 million a year, but if he gets banned off YouTube, well, then the Daily Wire would dock him. But again, what this comes down to is being about money. And it might just be that the Daily Wire doesn't believe in Crowder, and they don't think that, and they're not willing to spend what Crowder thinks he's worth. And Crowder may very well be right that he's going to be able to generate, more than enough revenue to justify a fee that is much higher to produce his show than $12.5 million a year. But again, at that point, it really is just business. It's a business disagreement. Boring and Shapiro and the Mercers thought, hey, Crowder's show is only worth this much, and they were wrong. Crowder's show ends up being worth, a lot more. They chose not to take the risk on an investment. They were risk averse. That to me is not like some great moral crime. I have many other problems with Ben Shapiro and the folks at the Daily Wire. Their risk aversion in business transactions is never something that is going to bother me. Crowder did say some things. He sort of alluded to things that, instinctually, on this Timcast show, made me want to sympathize more with him, made me want to side with him more. But they weren't super substantiated, because he was saying, I've got behind-the-scenes sources who tell me that, he was essentially saying that the Daily Wire was colluding with big tech to prop up YouTube and to stem people leaving, YouTube and these other places and going to alternative sources, essentially doing the opposite of what they're telling their subscribers, saying, hey, subscribe to us and help us build up, Daily Wire Plus so we can have an independent network. But in the meantime, please patronize us on these other social sites where we can get ad revenue. Instead, Crowder was essentially saying, but he offered, in the 40 minutes that I listened to before I eventually turned it off, and I think I'll go back and listen to the rest, when he was talking about this, he didn't offer any specifics. He essentially was saying, well, this is something I've got in my back pocket. And if that's the case, I'd like to see that, because that would be very different if the Daily Wire was directly, or was, overtly lying to their subscribers about what the nature of their business is. But, I feel it. I've said this before, I don't like the Daily Wire guys. I would never subscribe to their paid program. I remember when Ben Shapiro first rolled it out. I remember saying at the time to myself, never will I pay money for this. And I still haven't. It's very, very rare that I even listen to a clip from any of their hosts, let alone Shapiro, who I can't stand. But, the others who are not as bad, I don't listen to them either. But here's the thing. If Crowder got what he wanted, if Crowder got a contract offer from them, if this is what if they think that he's worth $50 million for 4 years with all these caveats, if they took all those caveats off, as I said in the last video, they're just going to offer him much less than $50 million. Now, is that going to make Crowder happy? No. Now, you can say, well, maybe then it just would have been a business disagreement. Then Crowder would have said, well, I think I'm worth more, so I'm not going to take your offer, and it would have been an amicable, end to the negotiations. But when you do something like this, when you try and put a bunch of strings on it, well, then it's just insulting to the artist, which was the point that Robert Barnes made on Sunday night on the Viva Barnes show. And I hadn't thought about it that way, because I don't really think of people in business negotiations as, as snowflakes. But then again, I've never been the one on the side of trying to lure someone in with money. You know what I mean? I've never been the one trying to hire some big talent. And so I've never really tried to think in terms of, okay, how would I try and persuade someone who has a lot of options on where they can work? How should I try and approach them to make a deal with me? I've always thought more from the perspective of the person receiving the offer. How would I react if I were Crowder? Not how would Crowder react if I were Jeremy Boring. I wasn't putting myself in Crowder's shoes in that, or I wasn't putting myself in his shoes trying to think like him. I was thinking like myself in his situation. But as Barnes said, these artist types, they're very sensitive. They react emotionally. And when they feel that they've been slighted or wronged, even if it doesn't make, the most business sense, they will completely break off their relationship with certain organizations or certain individuals because they don't like working with them, which is perfectly valid reason, I think, not to work with someone. And so, in Barnes's opinion, Boring and the Daily Wire folks, the whole management there, whoever was involved with this, completely bungled this deal. By definition, because they pissed off Crowder this much, it has created a huge negative publicity firestorm for their company. So it doesn't matter whether or not I think that their terms were, not insulting, and that they were understandable, even if I wouldn't have wanted to take the deal. Two completely different ideas. Is it insulting? One, or two, do I like it? Those are two separate questions. But it doesn't matter whether or not I think that the terms are insulting, whether I think that they're completely unreasonable. All that matters is that this really important, media figure who they were trying to lure in, is he going to get pissed at it? And since he did, that's created a lot of trouble for them. I went into this. I decided to talk about this today because I really thought that my opinion had changed and evolved much. But the more I talked about it, the more I find that my opinion hasn't changed. Maybe I was just caught because in the initial thing, because I'm recording this right after watching it. And when I was watching it, I really felt like, you know what? No, maybe I was wrong. This Crowder guy's right. But it wasn't anything specific. It was just the feeling I got. And so I was saying, you know what? I need to talk about this again. I need to update my thoughts. But then I came into it, and I never do this with notes. I always am just thinking out loud. As I thought about it, I thought, you know what? No, I really don't really agree with his position all that much. That is on a micro perspective. He has more of a macro point. And his macro point here is that about the industry is that this is not conducive to really making a difference politically. And that, might be a perfectly valid point. And maybe he's just so upset because he thought that Ben Shapiro, of all people, was in this business primarily because he wants to further some kind of message. Particularly the same message that Steven Crowder believes in. Maybe he's disappointed because the people at the Daily Wire aren't as committed to the same ideals as he is, to the extent that he falsely believed. And I, as someone who didn't really respect them from, in that way to begin with, I've never thought of, Ben Shapiro as some great warrior for freedom. Far from it. I'm not disappointed in them. They are essentially acting as I would expect. I look at someone like Jeremy Boring, who I've never really, I guess he's vaguely on the right. I've never really, seen him as much of an ideological ally. When he makes a point like this and talks about the deal, it's just, to me, he sounds like a guy who's trying to make money and run a successful business. That, to me, is not nuts. But if you're coming at it from the perspective of, Jeremy Boring is supposed to be some general in the, cold Civil War, and that he's supposed to fiercely lead his Daily Wire troops into battle against the leftoids, then perhaps you would find this whole situation to be quite jarring. So at the end of the day, I do like Crowder's side better. I would much rather we live in a world. I think that the world would be a better place, and by world I mean sort of the right media space would be better if Crowder's attitude was dominant. Especially since, these companies like Daily Wire, they only exist because of billionaires like the Mercers injecting however many billions of dollars to start them up. And, they ran in the hole for so many years before they ever turned a profit. I'm sure there would have been more profitable investments the Mercers could have made. And, by the way, Mercers, not people I'm a fan of. But, continuing on with this point, if you're going to make the investment and you understand that you're already not going to make as much money as you could investing in some other industry, maybe you should just, go all the way in and try and be as committed as possible to the ideology that you claim to represent. And in Crowder's view, I think that means providing a platform with money that is independent of the big tech system. Essentially, sure, you want some of that money, that ad revenue off the top if you can get it, but you shouldn't be reliant on it. But as I would warn him, in that world, I'm sure his show would be worth a lot less money and would generate less money. If all of the revenue from Crowder's show came through, subscriptions on Daily Wire to Daily Wire Plus, it would not make as much money as it would under a subscription plus, ad revenue driven model. I.e., in a world where Steven Crowder is not completely demonetized on all social media platforms, or even banned on all social media platforms, his show would generate more revenue than it does in a world where it is purely behind a paywall. So this has gone on way too long because it really is a boring topic. So with that said, I will see folks back here tomorrow.